nursery together, Karen decided to talk to her husband again about something they had long been concerned about: the need to adopt a child. The fact that they most likely would not have children became clear 5 years after the wedding. After ineffective attempts, Karen went to the doctors, but nothing helped. The woman would have continued to torment herself with various procedures and medications, but one experienced doctor finally told her bluntly that there was practically no chance of getting pregnant. Even with expensive multi-year treatments or IVF, there were no guarantees, and the doctor advised her not to waste time and money and to consider adoption. After realizing the terrible news that she would never become a mother, Karen, after sobbing for several days, threw away all her medication and said to her husband, "Paul, that's enough. We have to face the fact that I am infertile. I'm stopping all this torment, and you have the full right to go to someone who can give birth to your child," spoke the woman, barely holding back her tears. "Come now, darling, I'll never leave you," her husband hugged her. "Well, if we don't have children, we don't need to. Well, we'll adopt, as a last resort. But in fact, the doctors can be wrong." Paul loved his wife, but he wanted his own children, not adopted ones. In later years, they returned to this subject many times, but Paul resisted. He feared that an adopted child might eventually develop a bad heredity, while Karen, on the contrary, believed that everything would depend on their upbringing. Time passed. Both were in their 30s. Finally, realizing his wife was resolved, Paul agreed to adopt a boy. "I'd be happy with a little girl too, or maybe better to have to take 2 kids at once." Karen sighed dreamily. "Only it won't work so easily. It's a serious matter. First we'll go and find out everything, get acquainted with the children, start gathering documents, and we'll also have to take special courses." "Well, 2 is too much," said bewildered Paul. "But you're right, of course, we need to take a responsible approach to this subject." The next day, the couple went to the orphanage. Karen immediately noticed a blonde-haired girl with blue eyes, lovely as an angel from a Christmas card. She sat all the time in the corner next to a boy who looked just like her. Karen found out that these children were twins and their parents had died. A new family for them was never found, for it was impossible to separate them, and not everyone could take 2 children at once. Karen immediately felt love and tenderness for these children and offered her husband to take them both. Paul was hesitant, but he still supported his wife. When the director of the orphanage heard that they wanted to adopt the twins, Peter and Maya, the experienced woman immediately sensed the doubts of the father-to-be. She warned the couple about the difficulties they might encounter. She even suggested choosing another child. But Karen assured the woman that she and her husband could handle it. So, the couple began to prepare for the addition to the family. During this time, Paul repeatedly tried to dissuade his wife, fearing that they would not be able to feed and provide for their 2 children. "Karen, think about it. The kids need so much." "Well, how do other families live?" argued Karen. "We make good money, after all. We could spend less on ourselves. We'll manage, you'll see." "Exactly, Karen. I am from a large family myself, and I know what it's like when you don't have what other kids have. I've had enough of living in crowded conditions and without enough money. You can ask my mother what it's like." Karen respected her mother-in-law, so she decided to ask her advice. Mrs. Parker did not discourage her daughter-in-law, but she was not happy about it either. Children are great, darling, but 2 at once is not easy in every sense. And then they're other people's children, and they'll always be other people's children. No way, they're mine already. Don't say like this. Her mother-in-law advised them to think it over, but Karen was firm in her decision. She had already imagined herself next to the children in her mind. She often visited them in the orphanage, doing everything to make them get attached to her. Paul, on the other hand, spent a lot of time at work and rarely accompanied his wife. Thanks to the mother-to-be's persistence and efforts, within 6 months, Peter and Maya were already living together with Karen and Paul on the rights of a son and daughter. The children were adorable and obedient and called their adoptive parents Daddy and Mummy. Karen was absolutely happy, but Paul couldn't say the same about himself. He might have loved the children, but he had to work a lot and spent very little time with them. The family's expenses increased considerably, and the husband often rebuked Karen. "I have to work without sleep or rest now because of your whims," resented Paul. "A whim? After all, it happens that people give birth to twins and live somehow," said Karen. "Exactly, they give birth to their kids, and these kids are not ours. My mother was right." Sometimes Mrs. Parker came to visit them. She seemed to be affectionate with the children, but Karen always felt her poorly concealed squeamishness, and one day she even overheard how Mrs. Parker was talking to her son, pitying him and considering it all Karen's fault. Karen, of course, was bitter to hear all this, but she did not have time to think about it for a long time, because raising children takes a lot of energy. As a result, Paul became increasingly distant from her and the children, and all her attempts at reconciliation were ending in quarrels. "Paul, the children miss you so much. Is it hard to come home from work and at least stroke their heads or play a little?" "That's easy for you to say. I work all day, I'm tired, and I don't have time for games." Similar conversations constantly happened, and one day Paul simply announced that he was leaving for another woman. "How? What about me? What about the children?" asked Karen frightenedly. "The kids? They won't even notice I'm gone, and you'll manage somehow. I've been dating with another woman for a long time, and she will give me my own baby soon. Understand?" This is how Karen became a single mother with 2 children. Paul quickly filed for divorce and even renounced paternity so as not to pay child support for the twins. He rejoiced at his newfound freedom, while Karen was crushed. She didn't know how she was going to raise her children alone. Her salary as a music teacher at school was catastrophically insufficient for their daily need. Maya and Peter grew up not capricious and loved their mother very much, trying to never upset her. But in spite of this, Karen sometimes had bitter thoughts about her unhappy fate. In moments of despair, she held her son and daughter close to her, thinking only that the years would pass, her children would be grown up and strong, and she would finally reap the benefits. "Don't cry, Mummy. We love you so much," said Maya pitifully, stroking her mother's hair. "We'll never leave you like Daddy did," Peter promised. Karen smiled and, hugging the children even tighter, told them that she was crying for joy because she had such wonderful children, and now she was definitely not afraid of anything. Such moments redeemed all the suffering and brought Karen even closer to her children, giving her strength to go on living. 3 years passed. Peter and Maya went to school. As before, Karen taught at a music school and gave private lessons. At first it wasn't easy, but gradually life began to settle down. She did not think about her personal life, devoting all her time only to her children. She did not recall her ex-husband either, and remained only grateful to him because they adopted children together, because she would not have been able to do it alone. But one day they accidentally met. Karen was hurrying to pick up her children out of school and suddenly noticed a man with a stroller on a bench in the park. He was sitting with a bottle of beer and smoking, not embarrassed that there was a child nearby. He had an extremely sullen and shabby appearance. Karen came closer and was shocked to recognize Paul. She was greatly surprised, for he had never smoked or drank before. She said hello, and Paul, who didn't immediately recognize her, was pleased to see her. "Hi, long time no see. How have you been? How are our kids?" "My kids," Karen corrected him. "They're doing well, just like your kids, I hope. Is this your second child already?" "No, the first. His name is Tom," replied Paul, frowning sharply. Only now Karen noticed that the child in the stroller was already not a baby, and he was obviously unhealthy. Paul grinned bitterly and told Karen about his difficult life. It turned out that his son was born with cerebral palsy. The boy did not speak, did not walk, and required expensive care, and unfortunately only Paul worked in the family. His new wife blamed him for everything and offered to put Tom in a special care centre. They even went and looked at how everything worked there, but in the end Paul refused, and now he feared that his wife would simply run away from him and leave him alone with his sick son. Karen felt sorry for her ex-husband and his child. She advised Paul not to give him up, because such children can be improved if they are constantly treated. "Karen, you were right to take healthy children, and my wife and I drew an unlucky lottery ticket." "Oh, it's easy to sit and pity yourself while drinking beer." Karen couldn't stand it and rebuked her ex-husband. "I just need to relax a little from such a life," said Paul defiantly, and threw the empty bottle into the trash. Karen shook her head and went about her business. She felt sorry for Paul, his son, and even his wife, but there was nothing she could do to help them. She had once been angry with her ex-husband, but she had never wished him anything bad. Meanwhile, fortunately, she herself was doing well, and she had no doubt that everything would continue the same. The children were healthy, doing well in school, making progress in music, and had already made many friends. Her daughter's best friend Shirley often came to their home. One day, Maya told Karen that Shirley's mother had died, and she was living with her father. When Karen heard about it, she began to pay more attention to the girl, understanding how much she lacked a woman's warmth and participation. Charles, Shirley's father, often came to pick up his daughter and sometimes had tea with Karen in the kitchen while they waited for the children to finish playing. They talked mostly about kids and parenting, but sometimes they shared their private. As it turned out, the girl's mother had died several years ago from a severe illness, and the man who had always dreamed of a large family was left alone with his daughter. "Shirley is so good, calm and studious, and she has a good ear. Would you like me to study music with her?" suggested Karen. "I don't know. I wouldn't want to overload her with study. But we could try if it's not too much trouble for you. And by the way, do you go to the amusement park with your kids? Maybe we could all go together sometime." From then on, they were almost inseparable. They went to the park, hikes, and celebrated all the holidays together. It seemed to everyone around them that they were one big family, and that Karen and Charles were the happy parents of 3 wonderful children. They understood everything themselves, but so far they had refrained from taking decisive steps, although they helped each other in all domestic matters. One day, when Charles, Karen and the children were leaving the mall, Karen encountered Mrs. Parker, her former mother-in-law. When the elderly woman saw Karen, she got pleased, and when she noticed Charles taking the children and grocery bags and going to the car, she just filled her former daughter-in-law with questions. "Karen, how glad I am to see you. Did you get married? Do you have 3 kids already? Maya and Peter are so grown up. Too bad they didn't even recognize me." Karen smiled and shrugged her shoulders, and having no desire to share the details of her life with Mrs. Parker, asked how Paul and his son were doing. "Oh, please don't ask," sighed the woman heavily. "I never liked his new wife. You were the best part of my son's life. Paul divorced again, and he went to work abroad. They gave up Tom and put him in a special orphanage not far from here. I wanted to visit him, but then I thought it would tear up my soul again." At this point, Karen was called by the children, and she hurriedly said goodbye to Mrs. Parker and ran to the car. The mood was ruined because of the conversation with her former mother-in-law. She couldn't stop thinking about Paul's unhappy child who had been abandoned, and in the evening she told everything to Charles. How could he? He wanted to have a son so much, and he didn't seem to have any intention of giving him up. And the boy is clearly not hopeless, just nobody ever took care of him properly. In fact, this child is nobody to me, but my heart aches for him. You know, I'll probably go to this orphanage, at least to ask if he needs anything. I just can't help it." "Good idea. Let's go together," said Charles, to Karen's great surprise. A couple of days later, they took sweets and toys with them and went to the orphanage. Seeing Tom sitting lonely in an armchair with sad eyes, Karen and Charles' heart squeezed with pain and resentment for this child. The woman spent a little time with the boy and immediately realized he was all right intellectually, but he speaks poorly. The child immediately reached out to strangers and tried to demonstrate his skills in every way to earn affection and praise. After promising Tom that they would come again, Karen and Charles said goodbye to the boy and went to talk with the principal. She said that the boy had come to them very neglected, and apparently his parents had not dealt with him at all, and valuable time had been lost. "Is he being tutored here now?" asked Karen. "Of course, but unfortunately it's not enough. There are so many ill children, and there's a catastrophic shortage of individual lessons." "Could I adopt him?" asked Karen suddenly. The thought had settled in her mind during the conversation with her former mother-in-law, and now she was finally convinced that she could not stay away. The head mistress said there would be no obstacles, but warned that the child would need a lot of attention and special care. "Don't worry, we can provide just that, and in enough quantities," suddenly declared Charles very calmly. Karen was surprised but didn't show it. They wrote the necessary papers for adoption and left the building. Near the car, Charles stopped, turned to Karen and said, "I'm sorry, maybe this isn't the ideal time and place for such a question, but I've been wanting to ask you for a long time. Karen, will you marry me?" "Charles, if you're only willing to do this for the sake of adopting Tom, then—" "No, I've wanted to for a long time, but I haven't made up my mind, and besides, we'll soon have to explain to the kids why you and I spend so much time together. But if you're against it, just say so." "I agree," Karen smiled, "and not just for Tom only, but because I need you." The wedding was modest, but everyone was happy. The children accepted the news that they were about to have a little brother who wasn't quite healthy and would require more careful attention. The couple decided to live in a larger apartment than Charles's and Karen's place to rent. Karen devoted her time to the children, and especially to the treatment of her youngest son. She studied all the available information about his illness, communicated on forums with those who were struck by the same misfortune, and she grew more and more confident that they would cope. Tom, feeling the love and care, really began to grow strong and make progress, and after his parents hired a good speech and massage therapist, everyone had hope for his recovery. Of course, there was still a lot of work ahead, years of rehabilitation, but the parents were sure of success. However, there were those who doubted, of course. Charles's mother, who had warmly welcomed Karen and her children, could not understand their desire to take on such a heavy burden as a sick child. She was anxious about her son, whether he could bear such hardships. "Mother, I've been through so much in my life that it's not hard for me at all. Besides, I'm confident that Tom will be almost a normal young man by the time he comes of age." "Well, God willing," sighed his mother. Karen knew about these conversations, but she was used to them. She had not yet forgotten how her former mother-in-law was against the adoption of healthy children. One day she met her again. Seeing Karen, the elderly woman shared her latest news about her son. "Paul got married for the 3rd time. Soon he will be a father, but he hasn't visited me once since then. Only calls sometimes." "Does he remember Tom?" Karen couldn't resist and asked. "He doesn't. Once I decided to visit Tom, but they told me that the boy had been adopted and refused to give the coordinates of his new parents. But I immediately realized that they just didn't want to upset me. He must be dead," said Mrs. Parker sadly. "I don't think they were lying. Well, I have to go to my family. We already have 4 children. Karen did not tell Mrs. Parker who the 4th child was. There was no need for her to know, and the elderly woman only pursed her lips and shook her head disapprovingly at her former daughter-in-law. And Karen really had a lot to do. There were no problems with the other children, but Tom took up a lot of time and energy. During the first years of his stay with the family, they were hospitalized several times for rehabilitation, and the constant care involved plenty of procedures, activities, and restrictions. But all of this was not in vain. It took a long time until one day Tom crossed the threshold of a regular school, and only his walk could say about his diagnosis.